Robert Morris thought the storm had already passed, but the latest turn has left even his closest supporters stunned. What began as whispers of trouble has spiraled into something far more alarming, raising urgent questions about leadership, accountability, and the future of his ministry. This isn't just another controversy. It's a terrifying twist that could change everything, and the fallout is only just beginning. Robert Morris had built his life on being a pastor who seemed untouchable. For decades, he was the face of Gateway Church in Texas, a megachurch that grew into one of the most powerful ministries in the country. People looked at him as a man of faith, a teacher who always had the right words, and someone who helped shape the modern evangelical world. For years, his reputation was spotless. He was respected, admired, and treated as a spiritual authority whose influence reached far beyond the walls of his church. But in 2024, everything shifted. What had once been whispered rumors suddenly became front-page news. The storm began with accusations that dated back more than 40 years. In 1982, when Morris was a traveling preacher in Oklahoma, he had allegedly been involved in a disturbing incident with a young girl. For decades, those claims seemed buried, known only in fragments, dismissed by some as old stories. But in early 2024, the past came crashing back when a grand jury in Oklahoma reviewed the case and filed 5 serious charges against him. His secret roomeries had filed 5 serious charges against him. The headlines spread quickly, and with them came shockwaves through the church world. This wasn't just about one man. This was about a leader who had shaped thousands of lives, suddenly facing the possibility of a criminal trial. For the community that had trusted him, the news was devastating. Many people had spent years listening to his sermons, donating to his ministry, and following his leadership. Now they were left asking themselves how to process the reality that the man they had respected could be at the center of such dark allegations. Some tried to defend him, insisting he was innocent and being targeted unfairly. Others admitted they had doubts all along, but no one could deny the seriousness of the charges. Morris himself tried to stay quiet in public at first, hoping to control the damage, but the story was too big to contain. News outlets dug deeper, uncovering not only the accusations from the 1,980s, but also questioning his current financial dealings and the way he had lived as a pastor. Overnight, his name, once tied to success and spiritual leadership, was tied instead to scandal and disgrace. What had begun as a respected legacy was now overshadowed by a legal battle that threatened to erase everything he had built. The fall was stunning. Just months before, Morris had been celebrated as a senior pastor who had changed the face of modern ministry. Now he was a man fighting for his freedom, his reputation, and his legacy. For many who had admired him, it was the kind of crisis they never imagined could happen. And yet, the legal storm was only beginning, and no one knew just how far it would go. The legal storm around Robert Morris was bad enough, but the scandal grew even bigger when money entered the picture. After his resignation from Gateway Church in 2024, the focus quickly turned to a shocking financial dispute that revealed just how high the stakes really were. Morris wasn't just stepping down quietly. He claimed he had been promised millions of dollars for his retirement, and he was determined to collect. According to Morris, the deal went back to 2014. He said church leaders had given him their word, though nothing was ever written down, that he would be taken care of for life. The agreement, as he told it, was staggering: a $1 million 0 cents lump sum payment, followed by yearly payouts of $800,000 0 cents until he turned 70. After that, the payments would drop slightly to $600,000 0 cents a year, but they would continue until his death. And once he was gone, his wife Debbie would keep receiving that $600,000 0 cents annually for the rest of her life. To Morris, this wasn't a gift. It was a promise, a reward for his years of service and leadership at Gateway Church. But when he finally asked for the money, Gateway flatly denied it. The church's leadership said there was no written record of such a deal. They argued that Morris's claims were based only on conversations and handshakes from years earlier. Without a signed contract, they said, there was no legal obligation to pay him anything. The church's stance was firm. It didn't matter what Morris believed he was owed. There was no proof. The dispute might have stayed behind closed doors, but the size of the money involved made it impossible to keep quiet. When the details leaked, people were stunned. Members of Gateway Church who had donated faithfully for years were horrified to learn that their former pastor expected millions of dollars in retirement benefits. Many asked the same question. How could a spiritual leader who had spent years preaching about generosity and sacrifice demand such an enormous payout? For Morris, the answer was simple. He believed Gateway owed him for building the church into one of the largest megachurches in America. Without him, he argued, Gateway wouldn't even exist. But for the church leadership, this wasn't just about money. It was about principles. They didn't want to set the precedent of paying out such huge sums, especially when the man asking for them was already facing criminal charges. The fight turned bitter. Morris tried to push the dispute into a process called binding arbitration, which would have kept everything private. Arbitration would have allowed both sides to present their case to a neutral third party behind closed doors, with no cameras, no headlines, and no public mess. Morris clearly wanted this path because the last thing he needed was more scrutiny. But Gateway fought back. They filed paperwork to block arbitration, insisting the case should be handled in open court. The church's leaders said the congregation deserved transparency. If millions of dollars were at stake, they wanted everything out in the open. That decision made the dispute even more explosive. Suddenly, the battle wasn't just about money. It was about trust and accountability. Gateway wanted to show the public that it wasn't hiding anything, while Morris seemed desperate to keep the details from becoming public record. As the weeks passed, reports began surfacing about Morris's personal wealth. Even after stepping down, he continued to buy and sell luxury properties across Texas, with some homes worth millions. Photos of sprawling estates, ranches, and lakeside mansions started circulating online. To critics, this was proof that Morris didn't need more money. They argued he was already living a life of wealth and privilege, funded in part by donations from everyday church members. The revelations fueled outrage. Congregants who had tithed faithfully for years felt betrayed. Many had given sacrificially, believing their money was going toward community outreach, missions, and church programs. Now they learned that their former pastor was fighting for a retirement package most people could only dream of, while living in houses that cost more than entire neighborhoods. For those inside Gateway, the scandal was heartbreaking. Some church members still felt loyal to Morris, believing he had earned the right to financial security. But others couldn't ignore the hypocrisy. How could a pastor who preached about humility and faith live in luxury while demanding millions more? The divide left the congregation shaken and disillusioned. Meanwhile, the legal fight dragged on. Every new filing in court made headlines, keeping the controversy alive. Morris insisted that Gateway was trying to back out of a promise, while the church insisted that he was exploiting verbal conversations that were never meant to be binding. Each side dug in deeper, and neither seemed willing to compromise. As the battle played out, it became more than just a financial disagreement. It became a symbol of something larger: the growing tension between faith and wealth in the modern church. Morris's case forced people to ask hard questions about what happens when spiritual leaders accumulate power, influence, and money. At what point does ministry stop being about service and start being about personal gain? By the end of 2024, the dispute showed no signs of resolution. Morris was still facing criminal charges, his reputation had crumbled, and now he was entangled in a financial fight that only deepened the controversy. What had once been a respected legacy of preaching and leadership was now overshadowed by headlines about millions of dollars, private estates, and bitter legal battles. For Robert Morris, the fight over money may have felt like securing what he was owed, but for the public, it looked like greed. And in the world of faith, where trust is everything, that perception was perhaps the most damaging cost of all. When the news about Robert Morris's wealth began to surface, it sent shockwaves through Gateway Church and far beyond. For years, he had preached about generosity, humility, and sacrifice. His sermons were filled with messages about trusting God with your money, about giving faithfully, and about how blessings come when you put God first. But behind the pulpit, Robert's lifestyle told a different story, and once it became public, the damage was impossible to undo. People started looking closer, and what they found painted a troubling picture. Even after stepping down as senior pastor, Morris lived like a man far removed from the struggles of ordinary church members. Reports showed he had purchased and sold multiple luxury properties across Texas, some worth millions. These weren't modest family homes. They were sprawling estates with lakefront views, expansive ranches, and high-end finishes that screamed wealth and exclusivity. For a man who had once spoken about living simply, it felt like a betrayal. Critics pointed to his real estate deals as proof that something didn't add up. While church members were tithing faithfully, often giving sacrificially, Morris was moving from mansion to mansion. Families who gave money they didn't really have, believing it would go toward ministry or helping the poor, now saw headlines about their former pastor's lavish lifestyle. To them, it wasn't just disappointing. It was enraging. Social media erupted with debates. Some defended Morris, saying that a pastor who had built one of the largest churches in America deserved to live comfortably. They argued that his success was a sign of God's favor and that his wealth was earned honestly through decades of service. But others saw it differently. To them, Morris's wealth looked like exploitation. They asked how a man of God could justify living in million-dollar homes while preaching to people struggling to pay rent or put food on the table. The distrust grew deeper when his retirement demands came to light. Morris claimed he had been promised millions, $1 million, 0 cents up front, followed by annual payments of $800,000, 0 cents, later dropping to $600,000, 0 cents, for the rest of his life, and his wife's life after his death. For many, this was the final straw. It wasn't just about real estate anymore. It was about entitlement. How could a pastor who had already accumulated so much insist on taking even more from the very church that had supported him all these years? Inside Gateway, the tension was thick. Some longtime members felt torn. They had loved Morris's preaching, and many credited him with changing their lives. But now they were being forced to reconcile that image with the reality of a man fighting for millions while facing criminal charges. Others didn't hesitate to walk away, canceling their memberships, cutting ties, and voicing their frustration loudly. Donations began to drop, and with every new revelation, the church's reputation sank further. What made the situation worse was how tone-deaf it all seemed. Morris never publicly acknowledged how the revelations about his wealth might look to his congregation. Instead, he pressed forward with his claims, insisting he was owed what had been promised. His silence on the outrage only fueled suspicions. It felt to many like he was ignoring the people who had built him up in the first place. Meanwhile, journalists and bloggers dug deeper, uncovering more about his lifestyle. Photos of luxury cars, expensive vacations, and even private jets started circulating. Whether all of it was true didn't matter anymore. The perception was cemented. Robert Morris, once seen as a spiritual father to thousands, now looked like another megachurch leader who had traded humility for wealth. And perception is powerful. Once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to repair. Church members began asking questions they had never asked before. Where exactly had their donations gone? How much of the money they gave in faith had ended up funding Morris's lifestyle? Were the sermons about generosity meant to inspire? Or were they just a strategy to keep the cash flowing? The distrust spread beyond Gateway. Other megachurch pastors came under scrutiny too, with critics pointing out that Morris's story wasn't unique. His fall became part of a larger conversation about wealth in the church, about how leaders who preach selflessness sometimes live in ways that contradict their own words. For those outside the faith, it was another reason to dismiss Christianity altogether, seeing it as a system built on manipulation and greed. For Gateway, the fallout was devastating. Attendance slipped, donations dropped, and trust eroded. Morris's legacy, once tied to the explosive growth of the church, was now tied to headlines about wealth, greed, and scandal. What had been built over decades unraveled in months, all because of the widening gap between the values preached and the lifestyle lived. Robert Morris may have seen his wealth as a blessing, the fruit of years of hard work. But for many who once admired him, it became the symbol of everything wrong with modern ministry. His mansions, his money, his demands for millions, they weren't just numbers. They were proof that he no longer lived among the people he preached to. And once the public reached that conclusion, the distrust became permanent. When Robert Morris stepped down from his role at Gateway Church in 2024, the world of megachurches and modern evangelical movements shook like never before. What looked at first like just another leadership transition quickly turned into a crisis, not just for one church, but for an entire way of doing ministry. Gateway had always been more than a local congregation. It was a symbol of what a modern megachurch could be. Huge campuses, millions in resources, global influence, and a message crafted to reach anyone, anywhere. But once the scandals, lawsuits, and questions about wealth started piling up, everything began to unravel. Inside the church walls, members felt the shift immediately. For years, they had trusted Morris, not just as a pastor but almost as a father figure. His sermons had been the center of their lives. They had built friendships, raised their kids, and invested money in Gateway because they believed in the mission. But now, they were forced to look at him in a different light, as someone caught up in criminal charges and locked in a bitter financial fight with the very church he helped create. The confusion was crushing. Some longtime members said it felt like losing their spiritual home. Others admitted they stayed only because they didn't know where else to go. The leadership that remained at Gateway scrambled to control the damage. They held meetings, issued statements, and promised transparency. They told members the church was bigger than one man, that Gateway's mission would continue no matter what happened with Morris. But people weren't so sure. Every headline about the case made it harder to believe those reassurances. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with a few carefully worded letters. And the crisis wasn't just about Morris's personal troubles. It went deeper. For years, Gateway had been built on the megachurch model, one that relied heavily on charismatic leaders, constant expansion, and enormous budgets fueled by donations. The model worked as long as members kept giving, as long as leaders stayed above scandal, and as long as the public believed the church was living out the values it preached. However, as the public feared, the church was living out the values it preached. But now, with Morris' lifestyle under the spotlight and the retirement dispute dragging through the courts, the cracks in that model were impossible to ignore. Outside observers started asking the same hard questions members were whispering inside. Why do churches need to function like corporations? Why do pastors accumulate wealth while teaching their followers to sacrifice? Why does a ministry supposedly focused on serving end up entangled in multi-million-dollar payouts and property deals? The Morris scandal became more than a personal downfall. It turned into a symbol of everything critics already believed about megachurch culture, that it was more about money and power than faith and service. Social media turned the situation into a firestorm. Clips of Morris preaching about generosity while living in mansions went viral. Memes mocked his demands for a retirement package worth millions. Former church members began sharing their own stories of giving beyond their means, only to now feel betrayed by how the money was used. Hashtags calling out church greed spread fast, dragging Gateway into a conversation that reached far beyond Texas. And while Gateway tried to separate itself from Morris, it wasn't easy. His name was tied to everything. He was the founder, the face of the church, the man who had shaped its identity for decades. Even as new leaders stepped up, the shadow of his actions loomed large. Members sitting in the pews couldn't forget that the man they had trusted was now facing criminal charges and fighting over millions with the very church they attended. The crisis also created ripple effects across the wider evangelical movement. Other megachurches felt the heat. Pastors who lived in large houses or flew on private planes suddenly faced renewed scrutiny. Journalists started digging deeper into the finances of other ministries, asking if Morris was just the tip of the iceberg. Some leaders rushed to make their finances public, hoping to show transparency before anyone asked too many questions. Others stayed quiet, hoping the storm would pass. But the damage to public perception was already done. People who had always been skeptical of megachurches now felt vindicated. To them, Morris was proof that the system was broken, that faith had become a business. Younger Christians in particular began turning away from large institutions, seeking smaller, local communities where they could feel a stronger sense of authenticity. For them, Gateway's crisis was the last straw, convincing them that the age of the megachurch might be coming to an end. Meanwhile, inside Gateway, the pain was personal. Families argued over whether to stay or leave. Small groups, once centered on studying the Bible, became filled with questions about money and leadership. Volunteers who had poured countless hours into the church felt taken advantage of. Some cried openly in services, mourning not just Morris's fall, but the sense of stability they had once found in Gateway. It wasn't just a scandal, it was heartbreak. The church's finances also took a hit. Donations dropped sharply, forcing leaders to make tough decisions about programs, staff, and future projects. Expansion plans were put on hold. Some campuses reported smaller attendance week after week. The momentum that had once seemed unstoppable now slowed to a crawl, and every financial setback was tied in people's minds to the controversy swirling around Morris. Even those who defended him couldn't change the reality. Some members argued passionately that Morris had given his life to the church, that he deserved to live comfortably, and that the attacks against him were unfair. They saw the legal charges and the financial disputes as part of a larger attempt to tear down a man of God. But for every defender, there were others who couldn't look past the evidence, the lavish lifestyle, and the endless justifications. As the months dragged on, Gateway found itself at a crossroads. Could the church reinvent itself without the man who had built it? Could it rebuild trust with members and the wider public? Or was this the beginning of a slow decline? Another example of how too much power and money can corrode even the most successful ministries. Jeffrey Marshon-Walker. The larger evangelical world was asking the same questions. For decades, megachurches had been seen as the future of Christianity in America. Massive congregations, slick productions, charismatic leaders, and global reach. But now, with Morris's fall, that model looked fragile. If one of the most successful churches in the country could be brought to its knees by scandal, what did that mean for others built in the same way? In the end, the crisis of Robert Morris and Gateway Church wasn't just about one man's mistakes. It was about a system that made those mistakes possible, maybe even inevitable. It was about the dangers of tying faith to wealth, about the risks of building movements around personalities instead of principles, and it was about the people left behind, faithful church members who had given their money, time, and trust, only to find themselves in the middle of a storm they never asked for. For Gateway and for the broader movement, the road ahead is uncertain. Some believe the church will recover, that new leadership and renewed focus on service will eventually heal the wounds. Others believe the scars are too deep, that the trust is too broken, and that the future of megachurches will never be the same. But one thing is clear: the crisis has changed everything. The conversation about faith, money, and power in the church will never go back to the way it was before.